The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming wilderness when Rafael Martinez first heard the sound that would change everything, a low, guttural growl echoing from the limestone cliffs that bordered his ranch. Most ranchers would have reached for their rifle, assuming it was a bear or mountain lion. But something about this sound was different. It carried a haunting quality that made the hair on his arms stand up, a primal desperation that spoke of something far more complex than any wild animal he'd encountered in his 32 years working this land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rafael had inherited the Sweetwater Ranch from his grandfather, along with its 8,000 acres of rugged terrain that stretched from the valley floor up into the foothills of the Wind River Range. It was an isolated country, the kind of place where your nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away and the postman only came twice a week. Most people would have found the solitude unbearable, but Rafael thrived in it. He understood the language of the land, the way morning frost warned of coming storms, how the behavior of his cattle predicted weather changes in advance, and where to find fresh water during the driest summers. The sound came again, the next morning, just as Rafael was checking the fence line near Copper Creek. This time he was closer, maybe 200 yards from the source. He dismounted his horse Ranger and approached on foot, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered grass. The cliffs rose nearly vertical here, riddled with caves and crevices carved by centuries of wind and water. Local Shoshone legends spoke of spirits dwelling in these rocks, but Rafael had always been a practical man who dealt in facts rather than folklore. The third time he heard it, Rafael was ready. He'd brought his binoculars and positioned himself downwind before dawn. As the sun crested the mountains, painting the cliffs in shades of gold and amber, he saw movement near a cave entrance about halfway up the rock face. At first, he thought, it might be a bear, but the silhouette was wrong, too upright, too deliberate in its movements. Through his binoculars, Rafael watched in stunned silence as a figure emerged from the cave mouth. It was human, but barely recognizable as such. The person, he couldn't tell if it was male or female from this distance, moved with a strange, hunched gait, staying low to the ground and frequently pausing to sniff the air like a wild animal testing for danger. Their hair was long and matted, their body covered in what appeared to be animal hides crudely sewn together. But it was the way they moved that truly unsettled Rafael, with the cautious, predatory grace of something that had learned to survive in the wilderness through instinct. Alone, for 3 weeks, Rafael observed from a distance. He learned the person's routine. They emerged from the cave just after sunrise, spent hours foraging among the rocks and sparse vegetation, and always returned before the sun reached its peak. They moved with surprising agility across the treacherous cliff face, navigating paths that would challenge an experienced rock climber. Their diet seemed to consist of roots, berries, small rodents they caught with improvised snares, and occasionally birds' eggs stolen from nests in the rock crevices. The person had clearly been living this way for a long time. Their survival skills were remarkable. Rafael watched them fashion tools from stones and bones, create fire using nothing but flint and dried grass, and even observed them weathering a 3-day storm by retreating deep into their cave and emerging only when the skies cleared. Yet there was something heartbreaking about their existence, a profound loneliness that Rafael recognized even from hundreds of yards away. The turning point came on a particularly harsh October morning when an early blizzard swept through the valley. Rafael had spent the night securing his livestock and reinforcing shelter for his horses, knowing that this kind of sudden weather change could be deadly for anything caught unprepared in the open. As the storm raged through the second day, he found himself thinking about the person in the cave. Did they have adequate shelter? Enough food stored away? The temperature had dropped nearly 40 degrees in 12 hours. and the wind was fierce enough to knock a grown man off his feet. Against his better judgment, Raphael loaded his saddlebags with supplies, a thick wool blanket, jerky, dried fruit, and a thermos of hot coffee, and made his way toward the cliffs on foot. The snow was already knee-deep and still falling heavily, making the journey treacherous. Ranger had refused to leave the barn, showing the good sense that Raphael seemed to have temporarily abandoned. The climb up to the cave was the most dangerous thing Raphael had ever attempted. The rock face was slick with ice, and the wind threatened to tear him from his handholds with every gust. But something drove him forward, a compulsion he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the rancher's instinct to protect all living things on his land, or maybe it was simple human decency. Either way, he found himself standing at the entrance to the cave, his heart pounding from both exertion and uncertainty. The cave was larger than he'd expected, stretching back into darkness beyond what his flashlight could illuminate. The entrance area had been carefully arranged stones placed to form a windbreak, animal hides stretched across openings to trap heat, and a fire pit constructed with rocks that showed signs of regular use. It was primitive but ingenious, the work of someone who understood survival in its most basic form. The person was huddled in the deepest shadow, pressed against the back wall like a cornered animal. In the beam of his flashlight, Raphael got his first clear look at the cave's inhabitant. It was a woman, probably in her 20s, though it was hard to tell through the layers of dirt and the primitive clothing. Her dark hair hung entangled, locks past her shoulders, and her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, held a mixture of terror and fierce defiance that made Raphael's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She made no sound, but her body language screamed danger. She was coiled like a spring, ready to fight or flee, her hands gripping what appeared to be a sharp piece of flint. Raphael slowly set down his saddlebags and raised his hands in a gesture of peace, speaking in the gentlest voice he could manage. "Easy there," he said, as if he were approaching a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you. I brought some things that might help with the storm." She didn't respond, but her grip on the flint tightened. Raphael noticed that her hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who had learned to work with stone and bone out of necessity rather than choice. Her feet were bare despite the cold, the soles thick with calluses that spoke of years walking on rough ground. Slowly, deliberately, Raphael pulled the blanket from his saddlebag and held it out toward her. The woman's eyes fixed on it with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what it was and what it could mean for her survival. But she made no move to take it, her distrust evident in every line of her body. Raphael set the blanket on the ground between them and backed away, then did the same with the food and the thermos. The woman watched his every movement with the hyper-vigilant attention of a wild creature, cataloging threats and escape routes with each breath. It was clear that she had no recent experience with human kindness, or perhaps with humans at all. Storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling through the cave entrance with a sound like lost souls. Raphael knew he should leave, that his presence was clearly causing the woman distress. But something about her situation struck him to the core. How long had she been living like this? How had she ended up alone in the wilderness, reduced to such a primitive existence? And most importantly, what had driven her to choose this life over whatever she had left behind? As if reading his thoughts, the woman suddenly moved. Not toward the supplies he'd offered, but deeper into the cave, her movements swift and silent. Raphael waited, listening to the storm and the sound of his own breathing. Minutes passed before she emerged from the shadows, carrying something in her arms. It was a bundle of animal hides, and as she unwrapped it carefully, Raphael saw what lay inside: photographs, faded and worn, but unmistakably photographs. A family portrait showing a younger version of the woman standing beside two adults who were clearly her parents. A picture of a small house with a white picket fence. Images of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of a normal life that seemed impossibly distant from this cave in the wilderness. The woman held the photographs protectively against her chest, her eyes never leaving Raphael's face. At that moment, he understood that she hadn't always been wild. She had once been part of the civilized world, with a family and a home and all the things that most people took for granted. Something had driven her away from that life, something terrible enough to make her choose this harsh existence over whatever she had left behind. Raphael felt a profound shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about survival, this was about a human being who had been so damaged by her experiences with civilization that she had rejected it entirely. And yet, the fact that she still carried those photographs suggested that some part of her remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere, to be cared for and protected. The implications were staggering. How did someone fall so far from the normal world? What kind of trauma could drive a person to abandon everything human and live like an animal in the wilderness? And perhaps most importantly, was there any way back from such a complete rejection of society? As Raphael watched the woman clutch her photographs, he realized that he was witnessing something that went beyond simple survival. This was a story of profound loss, of a human being who had been pushed beyond the breaking point and had chosen the wilderness over whatever horrors she had faced in the civilized world. The cave wasn't just her shelter, it was her sanctuary. The only place where she felt safe from whatever demons had driven her here. The storm continued to howl outside, trapping them both in this moment of strange intimacy. Raphael knew that his life had just taken an unexpected turn, that he had stumbled upon something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about human nature and the bonds that hold society together. The woman in the cave wasn't just a curiosity or a problem to be solved. She was a person who had been failed by the very civilization that Raphael represented. And somehow, inexplicably, he felt responsible for finding a way to bridge the gap between her world and his. The blizzard finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a crystalline world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow. Raphael had returned to his ranch that first night, but not before leaving all his supplies at the cave entrance. When he came back the next morning, everything was gone except for a single item one of the photographs placed deliberately on a flat rock where he couldn't miss it. It was the picture of the small house with the white picket fence. On the back, written in faded pencil, were the words, Emma Blackwood, 1247 Maple Street, Cedar Falls, Iowa. The handwriting was careful and precise, the kind taught in elementary schools decades ago. Emma. Her name was Emma, and she had once lived in Iowa, in a house that represented everything normal and safe about American life. Raphael stared at that address for a long time, understanding that Emma had given him something precious, not just her name, but a piece of her past. It was a gesture of trust, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably deliberate. She could have kept the photographs hidden, could have taken his supplies without revealing anything about herself. Instead, she had chosen to share this fragment of who she used to be. Over the following weeks, Raphael established a routine. Every morning, he would ride out to the cliffs and leave supplies at the base of the trail leading to Emma's cave. Never too much, he sensed that overwhelming her with generosity might trigger her flight instincts. A thermos of soup, a pair of wool socks, sometimes just an apple or a handful of crackers. Each offering was an invitation, a quiet message that said he hadn't forgotten about her and didn't plan to abandon her to the wilderness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma began leaving things in return. Not photographs this time, but objects that spoke to her resourcefulness and intelligence. A perfectly woven grass basket, a necklace made from polished stones and bird bones that showed remarkable artistic skill. Once, she left a detailed map drawn on a piece of bark, showing water sources and game trails throughout the area, information that would have taken Raphael years to gather on his own. The exchange of gifts continued through November and into December. Raphael found himself looking forward to these morning trips with an anticipation that surprised him. What would Emma leave today? How was she surviving the increasingly harsh weather? Sometimes he would catch glimpses of her watching him from the cliff face, her form barely distinguishable from the rock and shadow. She was learning to trust him, he realized, but on her own terms and at her own pace. The first real breakthrough came during a week of unusually mild weather in mid-December. Raphael had left a small solar radio at the base of the cliff, thinking that Emma might enjoy hearing music or news from the outside world. When he returned the next day, the radio was gone, but in its place was something that made his heart skip a note written on a piece of birch bark with what appeared to be charcoal from her fire. "Thank you for the music," it read. "I remember dancing." 4 words that contained entire worlds of meaning. Emma remembered dancing, which meant she remembered joy, celebration, the simple pleasure of moving to rhythm and melody. It was a crack in the wall she had built around herself, a glimpse of the person she had been before whatever trauma had driven her to the cliffs. Raphael began including small luxuries in his offerings. A bar of soap that smelled like lavender, a compact mirror, a comb with an intricate silver handle that he'd found in his grandmother's belongings. Each item was chosen carefully, designed to remind Emma of feminine pleasures she might have forgotten. The soap disappeared first, then the mirror, and finally the comb. In return, she left him more notes, brief but increasingly personal. "The soap makes me remember my mother's garden. I see my face differently now. My hair knows the comb's kindness." These fragments of communication revealed a woman of surprising eloquence, someone who thought in poetry even while living like a primitive. Raphael began to understand that Emma's isolation wasn't the result of mental illness or inability to function in society. She was articulate, observant, and clearly intelligent. Her choice to live in the wilderness was deliberate, a conscious rejection of something in the civilized world that had wounded her deeply. As winter tightened its grip on the Wyoming landscape, Raphael found himself researching Emma's past. The address she had given him led to a house that had been demolished 15 years earlier to make way for a shopping center. Public records showed that Harold and Marjorie Blackwood had indeed lived there, along with their daughter Emma, until a house fire in 2009 had killed both parents and left Emma, then 19, as the sole survivor. The newspaper articles from that time painted a picture of a promising young woman whose life had been shattered by tragedy. Emma had been a pre-med student at the University of Iowa, Dean's List every semester, engaged to marry her high school sweetheart. The fire had been ruled accidental, a faulty space heater in the basement, but the loss had apparently been too much for Emma to bear. The last article Raphael could find mentioned that she had withdrawn from school and moved away from Cedar Falls, but there was no trace of her after that. 15 years. Emma had been living in the wilderness for 15 years, surviving entirely on her own in some of the harshest country in North America. The magnitude of her achievement was staggering. She had taught herself skills that most people couldn't learn with professional instruction. She had endured winters that would have killed experienced outdoorsmen. She had created a life entirely separate from human society, sustained by nothing but her own determination and ingenuity. But the photographs she carried suggested that isolation hadn't healed whatever wounds had driven her to the cliffs. She was surviving but not thriving. She was alive but not truly living. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Raphael felt compelled to try bridging the gap between her world and his. The opportunity came during the worst storm of the winter. A howling blizzard that dropped the temperature to 40 below zero and brought winds strong enough to uproot trees. Raphael knew that no shelter, no matter how well constructed, could protect someone from weather this severe without adequate heat, and supplies. Emma's cave might keep her alive, but barely. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Raphael loaded his snowmobile with emergency supplies and headed for the cliffs. The journey was treacherous, visibility reduced to mere feet by the driving snow. Several times he became disoriented and had to stop, using his GPS to navigate by coordinates rather than landmarks. The cold was so intense that even his heated gear couldn't keep the chill from seeping into his bones. When he finally reached the base of the cliff, Raphael faced his greatest challenge, yet climbing to Emma's cave in conditions that would have challenged a professional mountaineer. The rock face was sheeted with ice, and the wind threatened to tear him loose with every handhold. But something drove him upward, a desperate need to ensure that Emma survived this ordeal. He found her huddled in the deepest part of the cave, wrapped in every piece of cloth and hide she possessed, but still shivering uncontrollably. Her lips were blue with cold, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Hypothermia was setting in, and without immediate intervention, she wouldn't survive the night. Raphael didn't ask permission. He couldn't afford to respect her boundaries when her life hung in the balance. He wrapped her in his emergency thermal blankets, fed her hot broth from his thermos, and used his portable heater to warm the cave to a temperature that wouldn't kill her. Emma was too cold and weak to resist, but her eyes never left his face, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and terror. For the first time since he discovered her, Raphael stayed in the cave overnight. The storm made leaving impossible. But more than that, he couldn't abandon Emma when she was so vulnerable. They spent the long night in careful silence, Raphael tending the heater and monitoring Emma's recovery while she gradually warmed back to a normal body temperature. It was during those dark hours that Emma finally spoke to him directly. Her voice, hoarse from disuse but unmistakably educated, with traces of a Midwestern accent that confirmed her Iowa origins. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked, her words barely audible above the wind outside. Raphael considered his answer carefully. He could have said it was simple Christian charity, or rancher's instinct to care for all living things on his land. But sitting in that cave, watching Emma struggle back from the edge of death, he realized his motivations were more complex than that. "Because everyone deserves to have someone who cares whether they live or die," he said finally. "And because I think you've been alone long enough." Emma was quiet for so long that Raphael thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally responded, her words carried the weight of 15 years of isolation. "I forgot what that felt like," she whispered, "having someone care." The admission hung between them in the flickering light of Raphael's emergency lantern. It was the first real conversation they'd had, the first time Emma had acknowledged their strange relationship as something more than just a practical exchange of goods and services. In that moment, Raphael understood that he had reached her in a way that no one had for 15 years, but he also sensed the fragility of this breakthrough. Emma was like a wild animal that had been offered food from a human hand interested, but still ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Whatever had driven her to reject civilization hadn't been healed by his kindness. It had only been temporarily set aside by the immediate need for survival. As the storm raged outside and Emma finally slept, wrapped in his thermal blankets and warmed by his heater, Raphael found himself at a crossroads. He had saved her life, but what happened next? Could she ever be coaxed back into the world she had rejected? Did she even want to be? And what right did he have to try changing a life she had chosen, no matter how harsh it appeared to outsiders? The questions would have to wait for morning, but Raphael already knew that this night had changed everything. Emma was no longer just the mysterious woman in the cave. She was a person with a name and a history, someone who had once danced to music and remembered her mother's garden. She was a survivor who had endured unimaginable loss and 15 years of solitude, but who still carried photographs of the life she had once known. Most importantly, She was someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have another person care about her well-being, and who was slowly, carefully, beginning to remember. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold the morning after the storm, revealing a world sculpted entirely in white. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind snowdrifts that reached nearly to Rafa's waist and a silence so complete it seemed to echo. Emma woke slowly, her dark eyes focusing first on the unfamiliar warmth of the thermal blankets, then on Raphael. Sitting quietly by the cave entrance, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink, she sat up carefully, testing her strength after the previous night's ordeal. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing was steady and normal. Raphael offered her hot coffee from his thermos, and for the first time since he'd known her, Emma accepted something directly from his hands without hesitation. "The storm's past," Raphael said quietly, not wanting to shatter the fragile peace of the moment, "but the snow's deep. It'll be a while before I can get back to the ranch." Emma nodded, sipping the coffee with obvious pleasure. "I haven't tasted coffee in..." She paused, calculating. "Maybe 5 years. I used to love it in the mornings." The admission was casual, almost conversational, but it revealed something profound about the life Emma had abandoned. Coffee was such a simple pleasure, one that most people took for granted. The fact that she had gone without it for 5 years spoke to the completeness of her rejection of civilized comforts. "What else do you miss?" Raphael asked gently, sensing that the previous night's crisis had created an opening for real communication. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around the warm mug as she stared out at the pristine landscape. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wistfulness that made Raphael's chest tighten. "Hot showers," she said, "clean sheets. The smell of bread baking." She paused, her expression growing distant. "I miss feeling safe enough to sleep deeply. Out here, part of you is always listening, always ready to run." Raphael understood. Emma had survived 15 years in the wilderness by maintaining constant vigilance. She had never allowed herself the luxury of complete relaxation, never experienced the deep, healing sleep that came from knowing you were truly secure. It was a level of chronic stress that would have broken most people, yet she had endured it for a decade and a half. "Why did you stay?" he asked. 15 years is a long time to punish yourself for surviving when your parents didn't. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes sharp with surprise and something that might have been anger. "How do you know about my parents?" Raphael pulled out the newspaper clipping he'd found during his research, the article about the house fire that had claimed Harold and Marjorie Blackwood. Emma stared at it for a long moment, her jaw clenched tight. "You investigated me," she said, her voice flat and accusatory. "I was worried about you," Raphael replied honestly. "I needed to understand what I was dealing with, what had driven you to live like this." Emma set down the coffee mug and pulled the thermal blankets tighter around herself, her body language closing off again. For a moment, Raphael thought he had pushed too hard, that she would retreat back into the silence and suspicion that had defined their relationship for months. But then she surprised him by speaking, her words measured and deliberate. "It wasn't guilt about surviving," she said. "It was what happened after. What people did to me when I was grieving and vulnerable." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Raphael waited, understanding that Emma was deciding whether to trust him with something she had never shared with anyone. "My fiancé," she continued finally, "David. He stayed with me through the funeral, helped me deal with the insurance and the lawyers. I thought he was being supportive. I thought he cared about me." Her voice took on a bitter edge that made Raphael's hands clenched into fists. "Turns out he was just waiting for the insurance money to come through. 24 hours. After the check arrived, he emptied our joint account and disappeared. Left me a note saying he couldn't handle damaged goods, and that I should get help. Raphael felt a surge of anger so intense it surprised him. The betrayal Emma described was breathtaking in its cruelty, to lose her parents, and then be abandoned by the person she trusted most. All for money. That's not the worst part, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. The worst part was how everyone else treated me afterward. The relatives who suddenly wanted to help manage my inheritance. The lawyers who tried to convince me to make investments that would have benefited them more than me. The doctors who wanted to prescribe pills to make me functional again. She stood up, pacing to the cave entrance where she could look out at the vast wilderness that had become her sanctuary. Everyone had an agenda, she said. Everyone wanted something from me, my money, my grief, my compliance. No one seemed to care about what I actually needed, which was just to be left alone to figure out how to keep breathing. Raphael began to understand the magnitude of what had driven Emma to the wilderness. It wasn't just the trauma of losing her parents or even the betrayal by her fiancé. It was the systematic exploitation by everyone who was supposed to help her. During the darkest period of her life, she had learned that civilization, for all its comforts and conveniences, was populated by people who would prey on the vulnerable. "So you ran," he said. "I ran," Emma confirmed. "I took what money I had left, bought camping gear and supplies, and headed west. I didn't plan to stay in the wilderness permanently. I just needed space to heal, time to figure out who I was without my parents, without David, without all the people trying to tell me how to grieve properly." "But you never went back," Emma shook her head. "After the first winter, I realized I was happier alone than I had ever been around people. No one was lying to me or trying to manipulate me. Number one was telling me I needed to move on or find closure. I could just exist without having to perform normalcy for other people's comfort." Raphael understood the appeal of Emma's choice, even as he recognized its fundamental tragedy. She had found peace in the wilderness, but at the cost of human connection, companionship, love. She had protected herself from further betrayal by eliminating the possibility of trust altogether. "Doesn't it get lonely?" he asked. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered peaks in the distance. "Loneliness is different from what I thought," she said finally. "It's not the absence of people, it's the absence of people who actually see you. I was lonelier in a room full of relatives and lawyers than I've ever been out here." The observation was profound and heartbreaking. Emma had learned to distinguish between mere human presence and genuine human connection. She had chosen physical isolation over emotional exploitation, and Raphael couldn't entirely blame her for that choice. But as he watched her standing in the cave entrance, silhouetted against the brilliant winter landscape, he realized that Emma's sanctuary had also become her prison. She had protected herself so completely from human cruelty that she had also cut herself off from human kindness, joy, love, all the things that made life more than mere survival. "What about children?" Raphael asked gently. "Did you ever want a family?" Emma's shoulders tensed, and for a moment he thought he had crossed a line. But then she turned back to face him, her expression vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. "I was going to be a doctor," she said quietly. "Pediatrics. I wanted to help children, maybe have some of my own someday. David and I used to talk about buying a house with a big backyard, getting a dog, having Sunday dinners with our kids." The life she described was so ordinary, so beautifully normal, that it made her current existence seem even more tragic by comparison. Emma had once dreamed of healing others, of building a family, of participating fully in the human community. Those dreams hadn't died in the house fire with her parents. They had been murdered by the cruelty and greed of the people who should have helped her heal. "You could still have that," Raphael said carefully. "You're only 34. You're brilliant, capable, stronger than anyone I've ever met. You could go back to school, finish your medical degree. With what identity?" Emma interrupted. "I've been legally dead for 10 years. Declared missing, presumed deceased. Emma Blackwood doesn't exist anymore in any official sense. I have no social security number, no credit history, no records of education or employment. I'm a ghost. Raphael hadn't considered the practical implications of Emma's long absence from society. She was right after 15 years of existing outside all official systems. Re-entering civilization would be incredibly complex, perhaps impossible without extensive legal intervention. There are ways to handle that, he said. Lawyers who specialize in helping people rebuild their legal identities. It would take time and money, but it could be done. Emma shook her head. Even if I could somehow become Emma Blackwood again, what's to stop the same thing from happening? What's to prevent the next David from seeing vulnerability as opportunity? What's to keep the next group of helpful relatives from deciding they know what's best for me? Her questions were valid and painful. Emma had learned that trust was dangerous, that vulnerability invited exploitation, that the very qualities that made someone human, the need for connection, support, love, could be weaponized against them by those who claimed to care. Not everyone is like that, Raphael said, though even as he spoke the words, he realized how inadequate they sounded. There are good people in the world, people who care about others without expecting anything in return. Emma studied his face. For a long moment, her dark eyes searching for something, sincerity perhaps, or hidden motives. Like you? She asked. The question was simple but loaded with meaning. Raphael understood that he was being tested, that his answer would determine whether the fragile trust Emma had begun to extend would grow or shatter entirely. I hope so, he said honestly. I can't prove it to you with words. But I've been coming. Here for months, bringing you supplies, checking on your welfare, and I've never asked you for anything in return. I don't want your money. I don't even know if you have any. I don't want to control you, or change you, or fix you. I just want to know that you're okay. Emma continued to study him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 15 years of disappointment and betrayal competing against the possibility of genuine human kindness. Finally she spoke. What do you want, Raphael? Really want, not just from me, but from life? The question caught him off guard. Raphael realized that in all his focus on understanding Emma's motivations, he had never really examined his own. What did he want? I want to matter, he said after a long pause. I want my life to mean something beyond just taking care of cattle and maintaining fences. I want to help someone who needs help, not because it makes me feel good about myself, but because it's the right thing to do. Emma nodded slowly, as if his answer satisfied some internal test. And if I told you that the best way to help me was to leave me alone, to stop coming here, to let me live my life the way I've chosen? To live it? Raphael felt his heart sink, but he knew he had to be honest. Then I would leave you alone, he said. But I would always wonder if you were okay, and I would always regret not trying harder to show you that not everyone in the world wants to hurt you. For the first time since he had known her, Emma smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and gave him a glimpse of the woman she had been before tragedy and betrayal had driven her to the wilderness. I'm not ready to trust the world again, she said quietly. But maybe maybe I'm ready to trust you. Emma's declaration that she might be ready to trust Raphael marked the beginning of the most delicate phase of their unusual relationship. Trust, Raphael understood, was not something that could be rushed or demanded. It had to be earned through consistent action over time. For someone who had been betrayed as thoroughly as Emma, every gesture would be scrutinized, every kindness examined for hidden motives. The weather remained harsh through January, but Emma began accepting more substantial help from Raphael. She allowed him to bring a small portable generator to the cave, along with a space heater that made the brutal Wyoming winter more bearable. In return, she shared more of her story, revealing details about her survival techniques that amazed. Raphael with their ingenuity and sophistication. Emma had become a master of wilderness medicine, treating her own injuries and illnesses with plants and minerals she had learned to identify through trial and error. She showed Raphael her collection of herbal remedies: willow bark for pain relief, echinacea for immune support, chamomile for anxiety and insomnia. Her knowledge rivaled that of trained herbalists, knowledge gained through necessity rather than formal education. "I got pneumonia my third winter," she told him as she organized her medicinal supplies. "Nearly died. That's when I realized I needed to become my own doctor if I was going to survive long term." She had fashioned surgical instruments from scavenged metal, created antiseptics from distilled alcohol and plant extracts, and even performed minor surgery on herself when a climbing accident had left her with a deep gash that required stitches. The scars on her hands and arms told stories of countless injuries, each one a lesson in self-reliance that had made her stronger and more resourceful. But it was Emma's intellectual pursuits that truly impressed Raphael. She had carved a chess, set from wood and bone, playing elaborate games against herself to keep her mind sharp. She had created a primitive printing press using carved wooden blocks, producing books of poetry and observations about nature that demonstrated a literary talent that had flourished in isolation. "Writing keeps me sane," she explained, showing Raphael one of her handmade books. "It helps me process experiences, work through problems. Sometimes I feel like I understand the world better when I can put it into words." Her poetry was remarkable, spare, precise language that captured the harsh beauty of wilderness life with startling clarity. Raphael found himself moved by verses about winter storms and summer sunsets, about the delicate balance between predator and prey, about the profound silence that could be both healing and terrifying. As February arrived with its promise of longer days, Raphael began bringing Emma newspapers and magazines, reconnecting her gradually with the outside world. She read them voraciously, absorbing 15 years of changes with a mixture of fascination and horror. Technology had advanced in ways that seemed almost magical to her smartphones. Social media, GPS navigation systems that made her primitive. Survival skills seemed both more impressive and more obsolete. "The world moved on without me," she observed, scrolling through news articles on Raphael's tablet. "Sometimes I wonder if I would even recognize the life I left behind." But it was the medical journals that truly captured Emma's attention. Raphael had brought them at her request, curious to see if her old passion for healing still burned beneath years of survival-focused pragmatism. Emma devoured the articles about new treatments, surgical techniques, and diagnostic tools that hadn't existed when she was a pre-med student. "Look at this," she said excitedly, showing Raphael an article about robotic surgery. "They can operate with machines now, making incisions smaller than a pencil point. The precision is incredible." Raphael watched her face light up as she read about medical advances, and he realized that Emma's love of healing hadn't died during her years in the wilderness. It had simply been dormant, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. The woman who had taught herself to treat pneumonia with herbs and improvised instruments was still, at heart, someone who wanted to help others heal. It was during one of these reading sessions that Emma made a statement that surprised them both. "I want to see a hospital," she said suddenly, looking up from an article about emergency medicine protocols. "Not as a patient, I just want to see how medicine has changed, what it looks like now." Raphael felt his pulse quicken. This was the first time Emma had expressed any interest in venturing beyond her wilderness sanctuary, the first crack in the wall she had built between herself and civilization. "There's a medical center in Casper," he said carefully, not wanting to seem too eager. "About a 3-hour drive from the ranch. We could go during the day just for a visit." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through uncertainty, fear, and something that might have been hope. "What if someone recognizes me? What if there are questions I can't answer?" Raphael had been thinking about this possibility for weeks. "You've changed a lot in 15 years, he said gently. "And you can use a different name if it makes you more comfortable. We'll say you're my cousin from Montana, visiting the area." The lie came easily, born from Raphael's growing understanding that Emma's reintegration into society would require careful orchestration. She couldn't simply walk back into the world after 15 years and expect everything to work normally. There would need to be preparation, planning, gradual exposure to environments that wouldn't overwhelm her or trigger her flight instincts. Emma considered his proposal for several days before agreeing, but only under strict conditions. They would go early in the morning when the hospital was less crowded. They would stay only for an hour. If she felt uncomfortable or panicked, they would leave immediately. No questions asked. The day of their hospital visit dawned clear and cold, with a brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a postcard. Emma had spent hours preparing, washing her hair thoroughly and wearing clean clothes that Raphael had brought, simple jeans and a sweater that made her look like any other woman her age. But Raphael could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats and escape routes. The drive to Casper was Emma's first time in a vehicle in 15 years, and Raphael watched her marvel at the smooth efficiency of his truck's heating system, the clarity of the radio, the GPS display that showed their exact location in real time. She was like someone from the past experiencing the future, simultaneously amazed and overwhelmed by changes that most people took for granted. "Everything's so fast," she murmured, watching the landscape blur past at highway speeds. "I forgot how fast the world moves when you're not walking everywhere." The hospital itself was a revelation for Emma. The gleaming floors, the sophisticated equipment visible through doorways, the efficient bustle of medical professionals going about their work, it all seemed to energize her in a way Raphael hadn't expected. She asked intelligent questions about equipment she didn't recognize, engaged doctors and nurses in conversations about new procedures, and absorbed information with the hungry intensity of someone who had been starved for intellectual stimulation. But it was in the emergency department that Emma truly came alive. A trauma patient arrived while they were observing a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and sustained multiple injuries. Emma watched the emergency team work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her medical training reasserting itself as she mentally cataloged the procedures being performed. "They're doing everything right," she whispered to Raphael, her voice filled with professional admiration. "The airway management, the floor placement, the way they're prioritizing injuries, it's exactly what I would have done." Raphael realized that Emma was unconsciously evaluating the medical team's performance, her dormant knowledge combining with her hard-won survival experience to create insights that might not have occurred to conventionally trained physicians. She understood trauma in ways that textbooks couldn't teach, had dealt with life-threatening situations using nothing but improvised tools and determination. As they watched the emergency team stabilize the patient and prepare him for surgery, Emma turned to Raphael with an expression he had never seen before: determination, mixed with something that might have been destiny. "I want to help," she said quietly. "I want to be part of this again." The admission was monumental, representing a complete reversal of Emma's 15-year rejection of civilized society. But Raphael could see that it came from a deep, authentic place, not from pressure or manipulation, but from Emma's own recognition that her isolation, while necessary for healing, had also cut her off from her fundamental purpose in life. "You could," Raphael said carefully. "It would take time, re-establishing your credentials, but your knowledge base is solid. Maybe even stronger than when you left school." Emma nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the emergency bay where doctors continued working to save the construction worker's life. "I know things now that I didn't know before," she said. "About survival, about what the human body can endure, about healing without modern tools. That has value. They stayed at the hospital for nearly 3 hours, much longer than originally planned, but Emma showed no signs of discomfort or desire to flee. Instead, she seemed to grow more confident with each interaction, more convinced that she might actually belong in this environment again. It was on the drive back to the ranch that Emma made the announcement that would change everything. "I want to try," she said, her voice firm with determination. "I want to see if I can become a doctor again. If I can find a way back into the world without losing everything I've learned in the wilderness." Raphael felt a surge of pride and excitement, but also a flutter of fear. Emma's decision represented hope and possibility, but it also meant the end of their isolated relationship. If she succeeded in re-entering society, she would no longer need his protection and support. She would no longer be the mysterious woman in the cave who had captured his imagination and stirred his protective instincts. "What would you need to make that happen?" he asked, pushing aside his own conflicted feelings to focus on Emma's goals. Emma had clearly been thinking about this question for days. "Legal help first," she said. "To re-establish my identity, get new documentation. Then I'd need to catch up on 15 years of medical advances, probably take some kind of equivalency exam to prove my knowledge is current." The practical challenges were enormous, but Raphael could see that Emma's determination was equally strong. She had survived 15 years in the wilderness through sheer willpower and intelligence. If anyone could navigate the complex process of legal resurrection and medical recertification, it was her. "There's something else," Emma said, her voice softer now. "I don't want to go back to being the person I was before. The woman who trusted too easily, who let others make decisions for her. I want to use what I've learned about self-reliance, about reading people's true intentions, about the difference between being alone and being lonely." Raphael understood. Emma didn't want to simply return to her old life. She wanted to integrate her wilderness experience with her medical training to become someone entirely new. Someone who could heal others while protecting herself, who could participate in society without being vulnerable to exploitation. As they pulled into the ranch, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, Emma made one final request that took Raphael's breath away. "I want you to help me," she said. "Not because I can't do it alone, I could if I had to, but because I've learned that accepting help from the right person isn't a weakness, it's wisdom." The trust implicit in her request was staggering. Emma was asking Raphael to be her guide back into the world she had rejected, to help her navigate a society that had wounded her so deeply she had chosen exile over engagement. She was placing her psychological and emotional safety in his hands, trusting him to protect her vulnerability. During the most dangerous transition of her life, Raphael felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mantle. Emma's healing journey was far from over in many ways. It was just beginning. But for the first time since he had discovered her in the cave, Raphael believed that healing was possible, that Emma could find a way to reclaim her place in the world without sacrificing the strength and wisdom she had gained in the wilderness. The woman who had lived like an animal in a cave was ready to rejoin civilization, not as a victim returning in defeat, but as a survivor returning in triumph, carrying knowledge and insights that could benefit everyone she would touch in her new life as a healer. The process of legally resurrecting Emma Blackwood proved to be more complex than either she or Raphael had anticipated. The lawyer they consulted in Cheyenne, Margaret Chun, specialized in cases involving missing persons and identity restoration. But even she admitted that Emma's situation was unprecedented. 15 years is a long time to be off the grid, Margaret explained during their first meeting. The good news is that you were never officially declared dead, just missing. But you'll need to provide extensive documentation to prove your identity, and there will be questions about where you've been and how you've supported yourself. Emma had prepared for this moment, crafting a story that contained enough truth to be believable while protecting the more extraordinary aspects of her survival. She had been living in remote areas of the western states, working seasonal jobs under assumed names, dealing with severe depression and anxiety following her parents' death. It wasn't entirely false. She had been dealing with trauma and had indeed been living in remote areas. The legal process consumed months of paperwork, interviews, and bureaucratic navigation. Emma had to obtain a new Social Security card, driver's license, and passport. She needed to establish credit history and banking relationships. Each step required patience and determination, qualities that Emma had developed in abundance during her wilderness years. While the legal machinery ground slowly forward, Emma threw herself into medical education with the same intensity she had once applied to survival. Raphael converted one of his ranch's unused buildings into a study space, complete with high-speed internet, medical textbooks, and online course access. Emma studied 16 hours a day, absorbing 15 years of medical advances with remarkable speed. She was particularly fascinated by advances in trauma, medicine, and emergency care fields where her hard-won knowledge of treating injuries with limited resources gave her unique insights. She began developing theories about wilderness medicine that integrated traditional healing practices with modern techniques, ideas that could revolutionize treatment in remote areas or disaster situations. "Look at this research on cold therapy," she told Raphael excitedly, showing him studies on hypothermia treatment. "They're finally understanding what I learned through necessity, that controlled cold exposure can slow cellular damage and buy time for proper treatment. I was doing this intuitively, but now there's science behind it." Emma's enthusiasm was infectious. Raphael found himself learning alongside her, amazed by her ability to synthesize complex information and identify connections that others might miss. Her isolation hadn't diminished her intelligence, it had sharpened it, forcing her to think creatively and see patterns that conventional training might have obscured. The first major milestone came when Emma passed the medical college admission test with scores that placed her in the 99th percentile. The achievement was remarkable not just for its excellence, but for what it represented: proof that Emma's medical knowledge was not only current but superior to most applicants with conventional educational backgrounds. But it was during this period of intense study that Emma faced her greatest psychological challenge since deciding to re-enter society. The isolation that had once protected her from human cruelty now worked against her, making social interactions exhausting and anxiety-provoking. Simple activities like grocery shopping or visiting the library required enormous mental effort. "I feel like I'm learning to be human again," Emma confided to Raphael after a particularly difficult day in town. "I know intellectually that not everyone wants to hurt me, but my body doesn't believe it yet. My heart races every time someone approaches me unexpectedly." Raphael watched Emma struggle with the complexities of human society that she had once navigated effortlessly. The woman who could track animals through trackless wilderness and treat life-threatening injuries with improvised tools was intimidated by casual conversation with strangers. The contrast was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Emma was essentially teaching herself to trust again. One interaction at a time. To help with this challenge, Raphael arranged for Emma to volunteer at the local veterinary clinic. Working with animals allowed her to rebuild her confidence in medical settings while avoiding the interpersonal pressures of human medicine. The veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was impressed by Emma's intuitive understanding of animal behavior and her innovative approaches to treatment. "She has hands that animals trust," Dr. Mitchell told Raphael privately. "I've never seen anything like it. Even the most aggressive or frightened animals calm down when she works with them. It's like she speaks their language." Emma's success with veterinary work gave her the confidence to attempt human medical situations. She began volunteering at the local free clinic, starting with simple tasks like taking vital signs and organizing supplies. The clinic's director, Dr. James Rodriguez, quickly recognized Emma's exceptional abilities and began giving her more complex responsibilities. It was at the free clinic that Emma encountered Maria Gonzalez, a young mother whose 3-year-old daughter had been suffering from recurring respiratory infections that conventional treatments hadn't resolved. The child, Sophia, was frightened and uncooperative with most medical staff, but she responded immediately to Emma's gentle approach. Emma spent hours with Sophia, using techniques she had developed for calming frightened animals to help the child relax during examinations. She noticed details that other medical professionals had missed, subtle signs of environmental allergies that were being overlooked in favor of more obvious diagnoses. "The mold in their apartment is making her sick," Emma told Dr. Rodriguez after spending an afternoon with the family. "Look at the pattern of her symptoms. They worsen after rainy periods when humidity increases. And see these marks on her arms? They're not eczema like everyone assumed. They're contact reactions to something in her environment." Emma's diagnosis proved correct. When Maria moved her family to a different apartment with better ventilation and no mold problems, Sophia's respiratory issues disappeared entirely. The success was more than medical, it was transformational for Emma, proving that her unconventional background could enhance rather than hinder her ability to help others. Word of Emma's diagnostic abilities began to spread through the medical community. Dr. Rodriguez invited her to present a case study at the regional medical conference, where her insights into environmental medicine drew attention from physicians across the state. Emma's presentation was nervous but compelling, demonstrating how survival instincts and traditional healing knowledge could inform modern medical practice. But it was after the conference that Emma faced her most significant test. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the chief of emergency medicine at Wyoming Medical Center, approached Emma with an unusual proposition. "I've been following your work," Dr. Hayes said. "Your approach to diagnosis is unlike anything I've seen in 30 years of practice. You see patterns that others miss, make connections that aren't obvious. I'd like to offer you a position as a consultant in our emergency department." The offer was unprecedented, a chance to practice medicine without completing traditional residency requirements, based purely on demonstrated ability and unique expertise. But it also meant returning to the high-pressure environment that Emma had fled 15 years earlier, surrounded by people whose motives she would need to constantly evaluate. Emma spent weeks considering the offer, weighing her desire to heal against her need for psychological safety. She discussed the decision endlessly with Raphael, who provided steady support while refusing to influence her choice. "Only you can decide if you're ready," he told her. "But remember that you're not the same person who was hurt before. You're stronger now, wiser. You know things about survival and self-protection that you didn't know then." Emma's decision came during a medical emergency at the ranch. One of Rafa's neighboring ranchers, Tom Peterson, suffered a heart attack while helping repair fence lines in a remote section of the property. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and the rescue helicopter couldn't land due to weather conditions. Emma found herself alone with a dying man, equipped only with basic first aid supplies and the medical knowledge she had accumulated over years of self-reliance. She performed CPR, administered emergency medications from Raphael's veterinary supplies, and used wilderness medicine techniques to stabilize Tom's condition until professional help could arrive. "You saved my life," Tom told her later from his hospital bed. "The doctors said I wouldn't have made it another 10 minutes without the interventions you performed." The incident crystallized Emma's understanding of her purpose. She wasn't meant to hide her abilities or limit her impact out of fear. She was meant to use everything she had learned, both in medical school and in the wilderness, to save lives and heal suffering wherever she encountered it. Emma accepted Dr. Hayes' offer, but with conditions that reflected her hard-won wisdom about self-protection. She would work part-time initially, maintaining her residence at Raphael's ranch where she felt safe. She would have final say over her patient assignments and treatment approaches. Most importantly, she would retain the right to step back if the environment became psychologically harmful. Her first day at Wyoming Medical Center was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Emma walked through the emergency department doors wearing scrubs and a white coat, carrying credentials that identified her as a consulting physician specializing in environmental and wilderness medicine. The transformation from cave-dwelling survivor to respected medical professional was complete, yet Emma carried with her every lesson learned during her years of isolation. Her first patient was a teenage boy who had been found unconscious in a local park, cause unknown. 3 doctors had examined him without reaching a definitive diagnosis, but Emma's enhanced senses detected something others had missed, a faint but distinctive odor that suggested carbon monoxide poisoning. "Check the carboxyhemoglobin levels," she told the attending physician, "and find out if he's been spending time in enclosed spaces with faulty heating systems." The blood test confirmed Emma's suspicion. The boy had been poisoned by a malfunctioning furnace in an abandoned building where he and his friends gathered. Emma's diagnosis, based on sensory abilities sharpened by years of wilderness survival, potentially saved the teenager's life. As Emma worked through her first week at the hospital, she realized that her 15-year journey from civilized woman to wilderness survivor to healing professional had given her something unique and valuable. She could diagnose conditions others missed because she had learned to perceive the world with heightened awareness. She could connect with frightened patients because she understood trauma intimately. She could improvise solutions because she had spent years making life or death decisions with limited resources. Most importantly, Emma had learned to trust her own judgment while remaining appropriately cautious about trusting others. She could work within the medical system while maintaining the independence and self-reliance that had kept her alive in the wilderness. Standing in the emergency department at the end of her first successful week, Emma felt a profound sense of completion. She had traveled an extraordinary circle from aspiring healer to broken survivor, to wilderness expert, to practicing physician. Each phase of the journey had been necessary. Each experience had contributed to making her the doctor she was meant to become. But as she looked around the bustling emergency department, filled with dedicated professionals working to save lives, Emma realized that her story wasn't ending, it was beginning. She had found her way back to civilization, not as the naive young woman who had fled 15 years earlier, but as someone entirely new, a healer who carried the wisdom of the wilderness into the modern world of medicine, ready to save lives. With knowledge that no textbook could teach, 6 months into her position at Wyoming Medical Center, Emma had established herself as one of the most innovative diagnosticians in the region. Her reputation for solving complex cases attracted patients from across the Mountain States, and medical students requested rotations, specifically to learn her unconventional approaches to patient care. But success in the medical field brought unexpected challenges that tested Emma's psychological resilience in ways that wilderness survival never had. The hospital administration, impressed by her results and the positive media attention she generated, began pressuring her to expand her role, take on administrative responsibilities, and represent the hospital at national conferences. Dr. Blackwood, the hospital's chief administrator, Robert Stevens, said during a meeting that Emma had tried to avoid, "Your unique background and diagnostic abilities could put Wyoming Medical Center on the map nationally. We'd like to discuss opportunities for you to lead a new department focused on environmental medicine." Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled her fight-or-flight response. The offer was exactly the kind of professional recognition that would have thrilled her younger self, but now it felt like a trap, an attempt to exploit her unique story for institutional gain rather than patient benefit. "I appreciate the confidence," Emma replied carefully, "but I'm not interested in administrative roles or publicity. I'm here to treat patients, not to be a marketing tool." Stephen's expression shifted, revealing the calculating nature that Emma's wilderness-sharpened instincts had detected from their first meeting. "Of course, patient care is paramount," he said with practiced smoothness. "But you have a responsibility to share your knowledge with the broader medical community. Think of how many more people you could help." The argument was seductive and might have swayed Emma years earlier, but 15 years of survival had taught her to recognize manipulation disguised as altruism. Stevens wasn't concerned with helping more people. He was concerned with leveraging Emma's story to advance his own career and the hospital's reputation. "My responsibility is to the patients in front of me," Emma said firmly. "That's where I can make the most difference." The meeting ended cordially, but Emma understood that she had just declared her independence from institutional pressure in a way that would have consequences. She was right. Over the following weeks, Stevens began subtly undermining Emma's autonomy, scheduling her for promotional events without consultation, assigning her to cases that would generate media attention rather than those where her skills were most needed. The situation came to a head when Stevens arranged for a documentary crew to film Emma at work without her knowledge or consent. She discovered them setting up equipment in the emergency department on a morning when she was scheduled to treat a young girl who had been found wandering in the wilderness after being separated from her family during a camping trip. "Absolutely not," Emma told Stevens when she confronted him about the cameras. "You will not turn a traumatized child into entertainment for your documentary." Stevens' mask of professional courtesy finally slipped. "You seem to forget, Dr. Blackwood, that you work for this hospital. Your contract gives us the right to document your work for educational purposes." Emma felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach, the same feeling she had experienced 15 years earlier, when she realized that people she trusted were exploiting her vulnerability. But this time, she wasn't a grieving young woman with no understanding of human predation. She was a survivor who had learned to protect herself. "My contract," Emma said quietly, "gives you the right to document standard medical procedures for legitimate educational purposes. It does not give you the right to exploit traumatized patients for publicity or to use my personal story for marketing without my consent." She pulled out her phone and showed Stevens the recording she had made of their conversation. "I've been documenting our interaction since I started noticing the pattern of pressure and manipulation. Would you like me to share these recordings with the state medical board?" Stevens' face went white as he realized that Emma had been several steps ahead of him throughout their conflict. The woman he had tried to manipulate was someone who had survived 15 years in the wilderness by accurately reading threats and preparing for them. "There's no need for threats," Stevens said, his voice losing its commanding tone. "I'm sure we can reach an understanding." Emma's response was swift and final. "The understanding is this: I treat patients according to my medical judgment, not your publicity schedule. I will not participate in promotional activities or media events. And if you attempt to use my story or my patients for marketing purposes, again, I will file complaints with both the medical board and the state attorney general's office." The confrontation established clear boundaries, but it also made Emma's position at the hospital politically untenable. Stevens couldn't fire her. Her results were too impressive and her contract too well crafted. But he could make her work. Environment increasingly uncomfortable through administrative harassment and professional isolation. It was Dr. Hayes who suggested an alternative that would allow Emma to practice medicine on her own terms. During a quiet conversation in the emergency department break room, she presented an idea that would transform Emma's career trajectory entirely. "Have you ever considered establishing an independent practice?" Dr. Hayes asked. "There's a real need for someone with your skills to serve remote communities that don't have access to specialized medical care." The idea resonated immediately with Emma. An independent practice would allow her to combine her medical expertise with her wilderness experience, serving people in rural and remote areas who faced medical challenges similar to those she had solved for herself during her years of isolation. "I've been thinking about it," Emma admitted. "But the logistics seem overwhelming: licensing, insurance, equipment, funding." Dr. Hayes smiled. "Those are all solvable problems for someone who figured out how to perform surgery with improvised instruments. Besides, you have resources you might not have considered." She was referring to Raphael, whose support had been unwavering throughout Emma's reintegration into society. When Emma approached him about the possibility of establishing a medical practice focused on wilderness and rural medicine, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. "The ranch has buildings that could be converted to medical facilities," he said. "And I have enough land to accommodate a helicopter landing pad for emergency transport. We could create something unique, a medical practice that bridges the gap between wilderness survival and modern healthcare." The vision that emerged from their planning sessions was ambitious and innovative. Emma would establish the Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center, offering specialized care for people injured or ill in remote areas, training for wilderness guides and outdoor enthusiasts, and research into environmental medicine and traditional healing practices. The project attracted support from unexpected sources. The State Medical Association, impressed by Emma's diagnostic abilities and frustrated by the shortage of rural medical services, offered grants and regulatory assistance. Equipment manufacturers, intrigued by Emma's innovative approaches to medical care with limited resources, donated cutting-edge portable medical technology. Most significantly, Emma's story attracted the attention of Dr. Michael Harrison, a renowned wilderness medicine specialist from Johns Hopkins, who had been following her work through medical journals. Dr. Harrison offered to partner with Emma in establishing the new facility, bringing his research credentials and academic connections to complement her practical experience. "What you've accomplished is unprecedented," Dr. Harrison told Emma during their first meeting. "You've essentially conducted a 15-year field study in wilderness survival and medicine, generating insights that could revolutionize how we approach healthcare in remote and resource-limited settings." The partnership with Dr. Harrison provided the academic legitimacy and research framework that would make Emma's practical innovation scientifically credible. Together, they began developing treatment protocols that combined traditional wilderness medicine with cutting-edge technology, creating approaches that could save lives in situations where conventional medical care wasn't available. The first major test of their collaboration came when a commercial fishing vessel ran aground during a severe storm off the Wyoming coast. Several crew members were injured, and weather conditions made immediate evacuation impossible. Emma and Dr. Harrison were flown to the scene by Coast Guard helicopter, carrying portable medical equipment designed for exactly this type of emergency. Working in conditions that reminded Emma of her cave-dwelling years, limited light and improvised work surfaces, minimal equipment, she and Dr. Harrison performed life-saving procedures that stabilized the injured fishermen until they could be transported to a full medical facility. The success of the mission demonstrated the value of their approach and generated national attention for the Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center. But for Emma, the most meaningful moment came when one of the injured fishermen, a grizzled veteran of decades at sea, gripped her hand as she prepared to leave. "You saved my life, Doc," he said simply. "But more than that, you understood what we were going through out there. You knew what it was like to be scared and hurt and far from help." Emma realized that her 15 years in the wilderness hadn't been a detour from her medical career. They had been essential preparation for it. The empathy and understanding she could offer to people facing life-threatening situations in remote locations came directly from her own experience of vulnerability and survival. As the Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center grew in reputation and scope, Emma found herself at the center of a new field of medicine that she had essentially created through her unique combination of formal training and lived experience. Medical schools began requesting her curriculum on wilderness medicine. Government agencies consulted her on emergency response protocols for natural disasters. International relief organizations sought her expertise in providing medical care in resource-limited environments. Yet despite the professional success and recognition, Emma remained grounded in the fundamental lesson of her wilderness years: the importance of maintaining authentic human connections while protecting herself from exploitation. She carefully selected partners and collaborators based on their genuine commitment to patient care rather than personal advancement. Her relationship with Raphael evolved during this period from protector and friend to equal partner in both personal and professional endeavors. Raphael's ranch management skills proved invaluable in establishing and running the medical center, while his steady presence provided Emma with the emotional security she needed to take professional risks. "You know," Raphael said one evening as they watched the sunset from the deck of the medical center they had built together, "I used to think I was rescuing you from the wilderness. Now I realize you were preparing yourself to rescue others." Emma smiled, thinking about the young woman who had fled to the cliffs 15 years earlier, broken and betrayed and convinced that civilization held nothing but cruelty for her. That woman had been wrong about civilization, but she had been right about the need to become strong enough to protect herself while still remaining open to genuine human connection. The Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center represented the synthesis of everything Emma had learned about survival, about healing, about the delicate balance between trust and self-protection. It was a place where her wilderness experience served others, where her medical training found its highest purpose, and where she had finally discovered how to be fully herself in the world. Standing on the deck of the facility she had built from nothing but determination and hard-won wisdom, Emma felt a completeness that she had never experienced in her previous life. She had found her way back to civilization, not by abandoning the lessons of the wilderness, but by integrating them into a new kind of life that honored both her need for security and her calling to heal. 3 years after establishing the FIO, Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center, Emma received the call that would test everything she had learned about human nature and her own capacity for forgiveness. The voice on the other end of the line was one she hadn't heard in 18 years. But recognized immediately despite the tremor of age and illness that now weakened it. "Emma, this is David David Morrison. We used to be engaged." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, triggering memories she had carefully compartmentalized during her years of healing. David, the man who had abandoned her in her darkest hour, who had stolen her inheritance and left her to grieve alone, who had called her damaged goods in a note that had haunted her for years. "I know I have no right to call," David continued, before Emma could respond. "But I'm dying, and there are things I need to say to you, things you deserve to hear." Emma's first instinct was to hang up the phone. Her wilderness-trained survival instincts screamed that this was another manipulation, another attempt by someone from her past to exploit her for their own purposes. But something in David's voice, a genuine brokenness that she had learned to distinguish from performed vulnerability, made her pause. "What do you want, David?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotional storm his call had triggered. "I want to apologize," he said simply. "And I want to try to make things right, if that's even possible after all these years." David explained that he was in the terminal stages of pancreatic cancer, with perhaps weeks left to live. He had spent the last several months trying to locate Emma, motivated not by hope for forgiveness, but by a desperate need to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had done to her. "I destroyed your life when you were at your most vulnerable," he said, his words coming slowly as if each one cost him tremendous effort. "I stole from you, abandoned you, and convinced myself that it was justified, because you were too damaged to build a future with. I was wrong about everything." Emma listened in silence, her emotions cycling between the old rage that David's betrayal had kindled and a newer, harder-won understanding of human frailty and the complex motivations that drove people to cause harm. The woman who had fled to the wilderness 18 years ago would have either hung up immediately or unleashed years of accumulated anger. But the person Emma had become through suffering and healing felt only a weary sadness. "Why now?" she asked. "Why wait until you're dying to tell me this?" David's laugh was bitter and self-aware. "Because I'm a coward," he said. "Because it took facing my own mortality to make me understand what I had taken from you. And because I finally realized that my guilt about what I did to you has poisoned every relationship I've had since." He went on to explain that he had never been able to maintain a lasting relationship after leaving Emma. Every woman he had dated eventually learned about his past betrayal, and most had ended things immediately upon discovering the kind of person he was capable of being. He had gone through Emma's inheritance within 2 years, lost everything to gambling and poor investments, and had spent the subsequent decade and a half living with the knowledge that he had destroyed the life of someone who had genuinely loved him. "I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness," David continued. "I know I don't deserve that. I'm calling because I found out about your medical practice, about the incredible things you've accomplished, and I realized that you became everything you were meant to be despite what I did to you. I wanted you to know that seeing your success has been the only good thing to come from this whole terrible situation." Emma felt something shift inside her as she listened to David's words. Not forgiveness, that would take much longer, if it ever came at all, but a recognition that her own healing had progressed to the point where his betrayal no longer defined her. She had become someone whose life was too full of purpose and meaning to be diminished by past cruelties. "There's something else," David said, his voice growing weaker. "I kept detailed records of everything I took from you. Every dollar, every piece of property, every investment. I've spent years trying to trace where that money went, and I've managed to recover about 60% of it. I want to give it back to you." The offer was staggering, not just financially but symbolically. David was offering to return, not just money but a piece of Emma's past, acknowledging that what he had done was theft rather than justified abandonment. But Emma's response surprised even herself. "Keep it," she said firmly. "Use it for hospice care or donate it to charity. I don't want anything from that time in my life." David was quiet for a long moment. "You've become someone remarkable," he said finally. "The Emma I knew 18 years ago would have needed that money, would have been grateful to get it back. The person you are now has moved so far beyond that loss that the money doesn't even matter to you anymore." Emma realized that David was right. The inheritance he had stolen had once represented security and freedom to her younger self. But the woman she had become had built security through her own efforts and found freedom through self-reliance. The money was irrelevant to the life she had created. "I have one request," Emma said. "If you're genuinely sorry for what you did, then use whatever time you have left to help someone else. Find someone who's vulnerable and protect them instead of exploiting them. That would mean more than any apology." David agreed to her request, and they ended the call with a formal politeness that acknowledged their shared history without pretending that genuine reconciliation was possible. But the conversation had stirred up emotions and memories that Emma needed to process, and she found herself drawn back to the place where her healing had truly begun. For the first time in 3 years, Emma climbed the familiar trail to the cave that had been her home for 15 years. The path seemed smaller than she remembered, less treacherous now that she was following it in hiking boots rather than improvised footwear. The cave itself looked smaller too, though she could see evidence that other people had used it occasionally, probably hikers seeking shelter from storms. Standing in the space where she had once huddled against the cold and isolation, Emma marveled at the journey that had brought her from that primitive existence to her current life as a respected physician and researcher. The cave had been both her sanctuary and her prison, protecting her from a world that had wounded her while also cutting her off from the possibility of healing through human connection. But as she looked around the rocky chamber that had sheltered her for so long, Emma realized that every moment of those 15 years had been necessary. The cave had given her time to process her trauma without outside pressure. The wilderness had taught her self-reliance and resilience. The isolation had forced her to confront her own thoughts and feelings without the distractions that allowed most people to avoid genuine self-knowledge. Most importantly, the extreme vulnerability of wilderness survival had taught her to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones, between people who meant her harm and those who genuinely cared about her welfare. Without that hard-won wisdom, she never would have been able to trust Raphael or accept the help that had made her reintegration into society possible. Emma's meditation in the cave was interrupted by the sound of voices on the trail below. A family of hikers had apparently become lost and were arguing about which direction to take. From her vantage point, Emma could see that they were heading toward a section of the cliff where the trail became dangerous, especially for the young children who were with them. Without hesitation, Emma climbed down to intercept the family, introducing herself as a local physician who was familiar with the area. She guided them safely back to the main trail, treated minor scrapes and dehydration, and provided them with detailed directions to their intended destination. "Thank you so much," the father said as they prepared to continue their hike. "We could have been in real trouble if you hadn't found us." Emma watched the family disappear down the trail, safe and reunited, and realized that this encounter perfectly encapsulated the transformation her life had undergone. She had gone from being someone who needed rescue to someone who provided rescue to others. The skills she had learned for her own survival now served to protect and heal other people. That evening, Emma shared the story of David's call and her visit to the cave with Raphael as they sat on the deck of their medical center, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Raphael listened without judgment, understanding that Emma needed to process these experiences aloud in order to integrate them into her ongoing healing journey. "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" Raphael asked when Emma had finished recounting the day's events. Emma considered the question carefully. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Forgiveness isn't something I can force or schedule. But I think what happened today helped me understand that my life has moved so far beyond what he did to me that holding on to anger would be like carrying rocks in my backpack during a long hike. It would only slow me down and make the journey harder." Raphael nodded, recognizing the wilderness metaphor that came naturally to Emma, even in discussions of emotional healing. "You've become someone who helps lost people find their way," he observed. "Maybe that's the best possible response to having been lost yourself." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Emma reflected on the unexpected symmetry of her life. She had started as a young woman who wanted to heal others, then broken by betrayal and loss, spent 15 years healing herself in isolation, and finally returned to healing others with wisdom and strength she never could have possessed without the journey through darkness. The cave that had once been her refuge was now just another place in the landscape significant for its role in her story, but no longer necessary for her sense of safety or identity. Emma had carried the most important lessons from her wilderness years back into civilization: the ability to distinguish between real and imagined threats, the strength that comes from proven self-reliance, and the understanding that genuine healing requires both solitude for reflection and connection for growth. David's call had been a test of how completely Emma had healed from the trauma that had driven her to the wilderness. Her response, offering him the chance to redeem himself through helping others rather than seeking revenge or even demanding restitution, demonstrated that she had not only survived her ordeal, but had been transformed by it into someone capable of responding to cruelty with wisdom rather than reactive anger. The Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center continued to grow in reputation and impact, serving as a model for how medical care could be provided in remote and challenging environments. Emma's research into wilderness medicine was being incorporated into medical school curricula across the country. Her treatment protocols were saving lives in disaster zones and remote locations around the world. But perhaps, most importantly, Emma had created a life that honored both her need for security and her calling to serve others. She had learned to trust again without becoming naive, to help others without sacrificing her own well-being, and to remain open to genuine human connection while protecting herself from those who would exploit her vulnerability. As she prepared for sleep that night in the comfortable bedroom of the home she shared with Raphael, Emma thought about the young woman who had once cried herself to sleep on a bed of animal hides in a cold cave. That woman's suffering had not been meaningless. It had been the raw material from which Emma had forged a life of purpose and service that she never could have imagined during her darkest hours. The transformation was complete, but the journey continued. Each day brought new opportunities to use her hard-won wisdom in service of healing, both her own and that of the people who sought her help in their own moments of crisis and vulnerability. 5 years had passed since Emma's conversation with David, and the Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center had evolved into something far beyond what she had originally envisioned. What had started as a small practice serving remote communities had grown into an internationally recognized institution that attracted medical professionals, researchers, and students from around the world. The center now occupied several buildings across Raphael's ranch, including a state-of-the-art trauma facility, research laboratories, and residential quarters for visiting scholars. Emma had established the world's first formal fellowship program in wilderness and environmental medicine, training a new generation of physicians to provide care in extreme and resource-limited conditions. But it was on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 20 years after Emma had first fled to the caves, that she faced her greatest challenge yet, one that would test not only her medical skills, but everything she had learned about human nature, trust, and the delicate balance between helping others and protecting herself. The emergency call came. In at dawn, a commercial aircraft had crashed in the remote Absaroka Mountains during a severe storm. The plane, carrying 43 passengers and crew, had gone down in terrain so rugged and weather conditions so severe that conventional rescue operations were impossible. The National Transportation Safety Board had contacted Emma directly, requesting her expertise in wilderness rescue medicine and her knowledge of the specific area where the crash had occurred. The wreckage is scattered across a canyon system, about 30 miles northeast of your facility, the NTSB coordinator explained during the emergency briefing. Weather conditions are expected to worsen over the next 48 hours. We have reports of survivors, but we can't get helicopters in safely, and ground teams would take too long to reach them. Emma studied the topographical maps and weather reports, her mind automatically calculating the challenges they would face. The crash site was in an area she knew well from her years of wilderness survival, a maze of deep canyons and unstable rock formations that became treacherous in bad weather. Reaching the survivors would require technical climbing skills and the ability to navigate in near-zero visibility conditions. "I'll need a small team," Emma told the coordinator. "People with advanced climbing experience and medical training. And we'll need to move fast if there are survivors. They won't last long in those conditions without proper shelter and medical care." Emma assembled her rescue team carefully, selecting individuals she had worked with extensively and trusted completely. Dr. Michael Harrison would provide surgical expertise if needed. Jake Morrison, a former Navy SEAL who had become one of Emma's wilderness medicine fellows, would handle the technical aspects of reaching the crash site. Sarah Chun, a trauma nurse with extensive mountain rescue experience, would coordinate patient stabilization and evacuation. But as the team prepared to depart, Emma received additional information that complicated the mission significantly. Among the passengers on the crashed aircraft was Dr. Richard Blackwood, her uncle, her father's younger brother, whom she hadn't seen or spoken to since her parents' funeral 20 years earlier. Richard had been one of the relatives who had tried to help Emma manage her inheritance after her parents' death, ostensibly out of concern, but actually motivated by his own financial difficulties. He had pressured her to make investments that would have benefited his struggling dental practice, suggested that she wasn't emotionally capable of making sound financial decisions, and had been one of the people whose manipulation had contributed to Emma's eventual flight from civilization. Learning that Richard was among the crash survivors created an internal conflict that Emma hadn't anticipated. Her professional obligation was clear. She needed to provide medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their personal history with her. But the prospect of facing someone who had exploited her vulnerability during the darkest period of her life brought back emotions she thought she had fully processed. "You don't have to go," Raphael told her as she struggled with the decision. "You could send the team without you. No one would question that choice." Emma considered the option, but ultimately rejected it. Her expertise in both wilderness survival and the specific terrain where the crash had occurred made her presence on the rescue team potentially crucial to saving lives. Her personal feelings about one of the passengers couldn't be allowed to interfere with her professional responsibilities. 20 years ago, I ran away from difficult situations," Emma said as she finished packing her medical gear. "I'm not that person anymore. If there are people dying in those mountains, I'm going to do everything in my power to save them, all of them." The helicopter flight to the crash site took 40 minutes through increasingly dangerous weather conditions. As they approached the coordinates, Emma could see the scattered wreckage spread across a narrow canyon, with pieces of the aircraft caught on ledges and in crevices throughout the rocky terrain. The main fuselage had come to rest on a precarious shelf about halfway down the canyon wall. Held in place by twisted metal and sheer luck, the pilot managed to land the helicopter on a flat area about half a mile from the crash site, but he warned that he wouldn't be able to return for pickup until the weather improved, which might not happen for days. Emma and her team were essentially marooned in the wilderness with limited supplies and multiple trauma patients who needed immediate medical attention. "It's like being back in the cave," Emma murmured to herself as she surveyed the harsh landscape, and felt the familiar sensation of being entirely dependent on her own skills and resources for survival. The descent to the crash site required technical climbing through loose rock and driving snow. Emma led the way, her body remembering skills she had developed during 15 years of navigating similar terrain. When they finally reached the wreckage, they found 14 survivors, most with serious injuries that would have been fatal without immediate medical intervention. Richard Blackwood was among the most severely injured. He had suffered significant internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and showed signs of traumatic brain injury. Emma found him unconscious and barely breathing, his body crushed beneath a section of airplane seat that would have killed him if the metal hadn't deflected at the last moment. For a brief instant, Emma hesitated. This was the man who had tried to manipulate her when she was grieving and vulnerable, who had questioned her mental capacity and financial judgment, who had been one of the reasons she had felt unable to trust anyone during the worst period of her life. But the hesitation lasted only a moment. Emma's medical training and hard-won wisdom about human nature allowed her to separate her personal history with Richard from her professional obligation to save his life. She immediately began emergency treatment, working with focused intensity to stabilize his condition and prepare him for evacuation. As she worked to control Richard's internal bleeding, using techniques she had developed during her years of improvised medical care, Emma realized that this moment represented the completion of a journey that had begun in those same mountains 20 years earlier. She was no longer the broken young woman who had fled from human cruelty. She was a healer who could respond to that same cruelty with professional competence and emotional detachment. The rescue operation lasted 3 days, with Emma and her team working around the clock to keep the survivors alive, while waiting for weather conditions to improve enough for helicopter evacuation. They had to create shelter from aircraft debris, ration medical supplies, and treat complex injuries with improvised equipment challenges that reminded Emma daily of her wilderness survival years. But the most difficult moment came when Richard regained consciousness and recognized her. His eyes widened with shock and what appeared to be genuine remorse as he realized that the person working to save his life was the niece he had wronged 2 decades earlier. "Emma," he whispered through pain medication and exhaustion, I never expected to see you again." Emma continued her medical assessment while responding professionally. "Don't try to talk right now, Richard. You have serious injuries that require your body to focus on healing." But Richard persisted, his words coming slowly but with obvious urgency. "I need to tell you what I did after your parents died. I was wrong. I was desperate and selfish, and I made your grief worse when I should have been helping you heal." Emma paused in her work, studying her uncle's face for signs of the manipulation she had learned to recognize. But what she saw instead was genuine remorse mixed with the vulnerability that comes from facing one's own mortality. Richard wasn't trying to manipulate her for personal gain. He was trying to clear his conscience before potentially dying. "We can discuss that after we get you to a hospital," Emma said calmly. "Right now my job is to keep you alive, not to process our family history." Over the 3 days they spent waiting for evacuation, Emma observed Richard carefully, both as his physician and as someone who had learned to read human nature with wilderness-sharpened instincts. She saw genuine regret in his behavior, a humility that hadn't been present during their interactions 20 years earlier. The man who had once patronized her and questioned her judgment now deferred completely to her medical expertise and leadership. On the second night, when Richard's condition had stabilized enough for conversation, he made an admission that surprised Emma with its honesty and self-awareness. "I spent 20 years wondering what happened to you," he said. "Part of me hoped you had found peace somewhere, but part of me was afraid that our family's treatment of you after the funeral had contributed to something terrible happening to you." Emma considered her response carefully. "I did find peace," she said finally, "but not in the way any of you would have expected." She told Richard about her years in the wilderness, though she simplified the story to focus on the healing and growth rather than the details of survival. She described her medical practice, her research, her fellowship program, painting a picture of a life that had grown from the ashes of the tragedy he had helped create. Richard listened with amazement and growing understanding. "You became everything you were meant to be," he said, echoing words that David had spoken years earlier. "Despite what we did to you, not because of it," Emma nodded. "I had to learn that other people's failures don't define my possibilities. Your behavior 20 years ago was about your own fears and weaknesses, not about any inherent flaw in me." The conversation represented a level of closure that Emma hadn't realized she needed. Unlike her interaction with David, which had been conducted over the phone with the safety of distance, this confrontation was happening in person, in circumstances where Emma held all the power and Richard was completely dependent on her good will for his survival. Yet rather than feeling vindicated or seeking revenge, Emma felt only a profound sadness for the years of guilt and regret that Richard had apparently carried. His betrayal had been cruel, but it had ultimately led her to discover strengths and capabilities she never would have developed otherwise. When the weather finally cleared enough for helicopter evacuation, Emma coordinated the rescue with the same precision and competence she brought to everything else. Richard was among the first patients evacuated, his condition stable but requiring immediate surgical intervention at a major trauma center. As the helicopter carrying Richard disappeared into the distance, Emma felt a sense of completion that went beyond the successful rescue mission. She had faced someone who had contributed to her original trauma and responded not with the anger or fear of her younger self, but with professional competence and emotional maturity. Dr. Harrison, who had observed the interaction between Emma and Richard throughout the rescue, approached her as they prepared to pack up their equipment. "I've never seen anything like what you did out here," he said. "Not just the medical care that was exceptional, but the way you handled the personal situation with your uncle. You treated someone who had hurt you with the same level of professional care you would give anyone else." Emma smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years ago, I thought strength meant protecting myself from people who might hurt me," she said. "I've learned that real strength means being able to help people even when they have hurt you, while still maintaining appropriate boundaries and self-protection." The rescue mission made national news, with Emma's leadership and innovative medical care receiving widespread recognition. But for Emma, the most meaningful outcome was personal, the realization that she had finally integrated all the lessons of her extraordinary journey into a coherent philosophy of life. She had learned to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones, to trust carefully but not cynically, to help others without sacrificing her own well-being, and to respond to human cruelty with wisdom rather than reactive anger. Most importantly, she had discovered that healing from trauma didn't mean forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It meant transforming the experience into wisdom that could benefit others. Standing on the mountain where she had once hidden from the world in fear and pain, Emma felt a profound gratitude for every step of the journey that had brought her to this point. The cave that had been her refuge, the wilderness that had been her teacher, the betrayals that had been her breaking points, all of it had been necessary to create the person she had become. The woman who had once lived like an animal in a cave had become someone who could save lives in the most challenging circumstances imaginable, who could face her past tormentors with equanimity, and who could transform personal trauma into professional excellence. It was a transformation that proved the fundamental resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of healing even from the deepest wounds. The aftermath of the airplane rescue mission brought unprecedented attention to Emma and the Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center. Major news networks wanted exclusive interviews. Medical journals requested detailed case studies. Publishing houses offered lucrative book deals for Emma's memoir. The sudden fame was overwhelming and unwelcome, triggering anxiety responses that Emma thought she had overcome. Dr. Blackwood, the CNN producer, said during a phone call that Emma hadn't wanted to take, "Your story is inspirational." A woman who survived alone in the wilderness for 15 years, then returned to save lives using those same survival skills. America needs to hear this story. Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled her flight or fight response. The producer's language, inspirational. America needs to hear, sounded too much like the hospital administrator who had tried to exploit her uniqueness for institutional gain. She was being positioned as a symbol rather than recognized. As a person, her complex journey reduced to a simple narrative of triumph over adversity. "I'm not interested in being anyone's inspiration," Emma replied firmly. "I'm a physician. My job is to treat patients, not to be a media personality." But the media attention persisted despite Emma's refusal to participate. Reporters began investigating her background, trying to piece together the details of her wilderness years from public records and interviews with local residents. Some of the coverage was respectful and accurate, but much of it sensationalized her story, portraying her as either a tragic victim or an almost superhuman survivor. The attention reached a crisis point when a tabloid newspaper published an article titled "Wild Woman Doctor, From Cave Dweller to Lifesaver," complete with unflattering photos taken with telephoto lenses and speculation about her mental health during her wilderness years. The article suggested that Emma's unconventional background raised questions about her fitness to practice medicine. Raphael, found Emma sitting on the deck of their medical center at dawn, staring at the mountains where she had once found refuge. Her face pale with stress and exhaustion. "I can't do this," she said quietly. "I thought I was strong enough to handle anything, but this feels like being attacked by the whole world at once. Maybe I should have stayed in the cave." Raphael sat beside her, understanding that Emma was facing a different kind of survival challenge than anything the wilderness had thrown at her. The cave had protected her from human cruelty through isolation, but her current life required her to remain engaged with society while protecting herself from exploitation and misrepresentation. "You're not the same person who fled to the cave 20 years ago," Raphael reminded her. "You have resources now, legal protection, financial independence, people who genuinely support you. And you have 20 years of experience in distinguishing between real threats and manufactured ones." Emma's response came from the wilderness medicine consultant Margaret Chen, who called with a proposal that would change the trajectory of both the media attention and Emma's career. "The World Health Organization has been following your work," Margaret explained. "They want to create a new position, Director of Wilderness and Emergency Medicine, specifically for you. It would involve developing protocols for medical care in refugee camps, natural disaster zones, and other resource-limited environments." The WHO position offered Emma something she hadn't realized she needed: international recognition that legitimized her work while removing her from the American media spotlight. More importantly, it would allow her to use her hard-won expertise to help people facing the kind of extreme vulnerability she had once experienced herself. "The position is based in Geneva," Margaret continued, "but it involves extensive field work. You'd be traveling to crisis zones around the world, training medical personnel and developing treatment protocols for situations where conventional medicine isn't possible." Emma felt a stirring of excitement that she hadn't experienced since establishing her medical center. The WHO position would combine everything she had learned at wilderness survival: improvised medicine, psychological resilience, and the ability to function effectively in extreme conditions. It would also remove her from the increasingly intrusive media attention, while giving her work global impact. But accepting the position would mean leaving the life she had built with Raphael, the medical center they had created together, and the community that had supported her healing journey. It was a choice between personal stability and professional growth, between the known safety of her current life and the uncertain challenges of a global mission. Emma discussed the decision with Raphael during long evening walks through the ranch, land they both loved. Raphael, characteristically, focused on what would be best for Emma rather than what would be easiest for their relationship. "This is what you've been preparing for your whole life," he said as they watched the sunset paint. "The mountains in shades of gold and purple. Everything you've experienced, the loss, the survival years, the medical training, building the center, it's all led to this opportunity." Emma felt torn between her love for Raphael and her calling to serve people facing crisis situations around the world. But Raphael, with the wisdom that had made him such an important part of her healing journey, offered a solution that honored both her need for mission and their bond as partners. "I'll come with you," he said simply. "The ranch can be managed by others, but your work needs someone who understands your history and can provide the kind of support that allows you to take risks for other people's benefit." The offer was generous and practical. Raphael's skills in logistics, resource management, and crisis coordination would be invaluable in the kind of field work the WHO position would require. More importantly, his presence would provide Emma with the emotional security she needed to face new challenges in unfamiliar environments. Emma accepted the WHO position with the understanding that Raphael would serve as her administrative coordinator, managing the practical aspects of their missions while she focused on medical care and protocol development. Together, they would travel to crisis zones around the world, bringing Emma's unique expertise to people facing situations similar to those that had once driven her to seek refuge in the wilderness. Their first assignment took them to a refugee camp in Jordan, where thousands of people displaced by conflict were living in conditions that challenged every assumption about modern medical care. The camp had basic medical facilities, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients and the complexity of treating people who had experienced severe trauma while living in extremely harsh conditions. Emma's approach to the refugee crisis was informed by her own experience of survival in challenging circumstances. She understood the psychological impact of losing everything familiar, the way trauma could manifest in physical symptoms, and the importance of treating people's emotional needs alongside their medical conditions. "These people aren't just patients," Emma explained to the camp's medical staff during her first training session. "They're survivors who have endured experiences that would break most people. We need to treat them with the respect and dignity that acknowledges their strength, not pity them for their circumstances." Emma's protocols emphasized the importance of understanding each patient's individual survival story, recognizing that their experiences of loss and displacement gave them insights into resilience that could inform their own healing process. She trained medical staff to look for signs of post-traumatic growth alongside symptoms of trauma, helping refugees identify ways that their difficult experiences had made them stronger and more resourceful. The work was challenging and emotionally demanding, but Emma found it deeply fulfilling in ways that her previous medical practice hadn't been. She was working with people who had experienced the kind of fundamental disruption of life that she understood intimately, using skills and insights that could only come from someone who had walked a similar path. Raphael proved invaluable in coordinating the practical aspects of their work, managing supplies and logistics while providing Emma with the emotional support she needed to remain effective in emotionally intense situations. Their partnership evolved into something even stronger than it had been at the medical center, forged by shared mission and mutual reliance in challenging circumstances. Their second assignment took them to the Philippines in the aftermath of a catastrophic typhoon that had destroyed entire communities and left thousands of people without access to medical care. Emma found herself working in conditions that reminded her of her wilderness years' limited supplies, improvised shelter, and the constant need to adapt treatment protocols to available resources. But unlike her years of isolation in the Wyoming mountains, Emma was now part of a team working toward a common goal of healing and recovery. She was using her survival skills not just for her own benefit, but to help entire communities rebuild their lives after devastating loss. The typhoon relief operation lasted 6 months, during which Emma developed new protocols for treating storm-related injuries and illnesses using locally available materials and traditional healing practices. Her approach integrated modern medical knowledge with indigenous wisdom, creating treatment methods that were both effective and culturally appropriate. The success of the Philippines mission led to additional assignments around the world. Emma and Raphael worked in earthquake zones in Nepal, drought-affected regions of East Africa, and areas devastated by conflict in South America. Each assignment brought new challenges and opportunities to apply Emma's unique combination of medical training and survival experience to help people facing extreme adversity. But it was during a mission to help victims of human trafficking in Southeast Asia that Emma faced her greatest challenge, yet one that would test not only her medical skills but her ability to maintain emotional boundaries while working with people whose trauma paralleled her own experiences of betrayal and exploitation. Trafficking survivors Emma encountered had been subjected to levels of abuse and manipulation that reminded her of her own vulnerability following her parents' death. Many had been betrayed by people they trusted, sold into slavery by family members or romantic partners, and had lost faith in the possibility of genuine human kindness. "I don't trust anyone," one young woman told Emma during a medical examination. Everyone who has ever said they wanted to help me was lying. They all wanted something from me. Emma recognized the defensive posture, the hypervigilance, the assumption that kindness was a prelude to exploitation. She was looking at a reflection of her own younger self, the woman who had fled to the wilderness because civilization seemed populated entirely by predators and manipulators. Working with trafficking survivors required Emma to draw on every lesson. She had learned about healing from trauma while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. She couldn't save these women by taking them to the wilderness. They needed to learn to navigate human society while protecting themselves from further exploitation. Emma's approach emphasized practical skills for detecting, manipulation, and protecting personal boundaries, combined with medical treatment for the physical and psychological effects of prolonged abuse. She taught the women to trust their instincts about people's motivations while remaining open to genuine offers of help. Healing doesn't mean learning to trust everyone, Emma explained during a group therapy session. It means learning to distinguish between people who are safe and people who are dangerous, and developing the strength to protect yourself while still accepting help from those who genuinely want to support your recovery. The Trafficking Survivor Program became one of Emma's most important contributions to international relief efforts. Her protocols for treating trauma in people who had been systematically betrayed and exploited were adopted by organizations around the world, helping thousands of survivors rebuild their lives without retreating into complete isolation. As Emma's reputation in international relief work grew, she began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and universities about her unique approach to trauma treatment and wilderness medicine. Unlike the media attention that had driven her to consider fleeing again, these professional invitations honored her expertise while respecting her privacy and autonomy. Standing before an audience of medical professionals at the International Conference on Emergency Medicine in Geneva, Emma reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a cave in the Wyoming mountains to a position of global influence in humanitarian medicine. Trauma is not something to be cured or overcome, she told the assembled physicians and researchers. It's something to be integrated and transformed into wisdom that can benefit others. My years in the wilderness taught me that survival is not just about staying alive, it's about learning to thrive despite circumstances that seem designed to break you. Emma's presentation received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it generated requests for collaboration from relief organizations around the world. She had found her true calling, not just as a physician or a survivor, but as someone who could help others transform their own experiences of trauma into sources of strength and wisdom. The woman who had once hidden from civilization in a cave had become a leader in the global effort to heal human suffering, using lessons learned in isolation to bring hope and healing to people facing their own moments of desperation and despair. 25 years after Emma Blackwood first fled to the caves of Wyoming, she stood once again on the familiar cliff face, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her was Dr. Ana Martinez, a young physician who had sought Emma's mentorship after reading about her work with trafficking survivors. Ana's story bore striking similarities to Emma's own, a brilliant medical student whose life had been shattered by betrayal and loss, who had spent 3 years living homeless on the streets before finding the courage to rebuild her life. I still can't believe you survived 15 years up here, Ana said, looking out across the vast wilderness that stretched to the horizon. The isolation, the danger, the complete self-reliance, it seems impossible. Emma smiled, remembering her own disbelief at what she had endured and accomplished during those years. When you're in survival mode, you don't think about whether something is possible or impossible, she said. You just focus on the next decision, the next challenge. The next day, survival happens one moment at a time. They were visiting the cave as part of Ana's training in wilderness medicine, but for Emma, the trip represented something more profound, a pilgrimage to the place where her true education had begun. The cave looked smaller than she remembered. weather-worn and unremarkable. It was hard to believe that this simple shelter had been her entire world for so many years. What was the hardest part? Aina asked as they explored the rocky chamber that had once been Emma's home. Emma considered the question carefully. The loneliness, she said finally. Not the physical isolation that was actually healing in many ways, but the belief that I could never trust another human being, that kindness was always hiding some selfish motive. That kind of emotional isolation is more dangerous than any physical threat. Aina nodded with understanding that came from personal experience. How did you learn to trust again? Very slowly, Emma replied. And I started with someone who didn't ask for anything in return, who proved his reliability through consistent actions over time. Raphael showed me that trust isn't an all-or-nothing proposition. It's something you can extend gradually, testing each step before taking the next one. As they prepared to leave the cave, Emma noticed something she hadn't seen on her previous visits, fresh signs that someone had been using the shelter recently. Blankets, food containers, and personal belongings suggested that another lost soul had found refuge in the same place that had once saved Emma's life. Someone else is living here, Aina observed. Examining the makeshift living arrangements, Emma felt a complex mix of emotions, concern for whoever had sought shelter in the cave, and recognition of the cyclical nature of human suffering and healing. Somewhere in these mountains was another person who had been driven to choose wilderness over civilization, isolation over the risk of further betrayal. We should leave supplies, Emma said, pulling emergency rations and medical equipment from her backpack, and a note letting them know they're not alone. Emma wrote carefully on a piece of paper, "If you're reading this, I understand why you're here. I lived in this cave for 15 years and survived. You are stronger than you know. When you're ready, there are people who will help without demanding anything in return. You don't have to stay hidden forever." Dr. Emma Blackwood, Sweetwater Wilderness Medical Center. As they hiked back down the mountain, Emma reflected on the strange symmetry of leaving hope for another refugee in the same place where she had once lost all hope herself. The cave that had been her sanctuary was now serving someone else in the same way, continuing its quiet role as a refuge for the broken and betrayed. 6 months later, Emma received a letter at her Geneva office. The return address showed no name, just a post office box in Casper, Wyoming. Inside was a brief note written in careful handwriting. "Dr. Blackwood, I found your message in the cave. I'm not ready to trust people yet, but knowing that someone like you made it out gives me hope that maybe someday I can too. Thank you for the supplies and for letting me know I'm not the only one who needed to disappear for a while." Emma kept the letter in her desk drawer, a reminder that her own journey from brokenness to healing was part of a larger human story of resilience and recovery. She had become not just a survivor, but a guide for others walking similar paths through darkness. Toward light, her work with the World Health Organization continued to evolve and expand. Emma had developed protocols that were being used in crisis zones around the world, training programs that had graduated hundreds of physicians in wilderness and trauma medicine, and research that was revolutionizing how the medical community understood the relationship between survival and healing. But perhaps her most important contribution was the network of mentorship relationships she had built with young physicians who had experienced their own traumas. Like Aina, these doctors brought unique insights to their work because they understood suffering from the inside. Emma's program had created a new generation of healers who could connect with patients experiencing extreme vulnerability because they had walked through their own valleys of despair. On a warm spring evening in Geneva, Emma stood on the balcony of her apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, video calling Raphael, who was visiting the medical center in Wyoming. Behind him, she could see the mountains where she had once lived in desperate isolation, now golden in the setting sun. "Any word from our cave dweller?" Raphael asked, referring to the person they had been quietly supporting with supply drops and medical care. She started leaving responses to my notes, Emma said. Very gradual communication, but definite progress. I think she might be ready for indirect contact, soon maybe meeting with Aina as an intermediary, Raphael smiled. It's like watching your own story unfold again, isn't it? Emma nodded. Except this time, I get to be the person extending help, instead of the one desperately needing it. There's something profoundly healing about being able to offer hope to someone in the same situation that once broke me. As they talked, Emma realized that her transformation was complete but ongoing. She had evolved from a victim of betrayal to a survivor of isolation to a healer of others. But each day still brought opportunities to choose compassion over cynicism, trust over suspicion, engagement over withdrawal. The woman who had once lived like an animal in a cave had become someone who helped others remember their humanity in the darkest moments of their lives. Her wilderness years, which had seemed like a tragic detour from her intended path, had actually been the most essential part of her education as a healer. Emma's story had no neat ending because healing never really ends. It just continues to deepen and expand, creating ripples of hope and recovery that touch lives she would never know about. The girl who had once been betrayed by everyone she trusted had learned to create a world where trust was possible again, where vulnerability could be met with protection rather than exploitation, where the broken could become healers of the broken. Standing in her apartment overlooking the peaceful waters of Lake Geneva, thousands of miles from the cave that had once been her entire world, Emma understood that she had achieved something remarkable, not just survival, but transformation. She had taken the worst experiences of her life and alchemized them into wisdom that could serve others facing their own moments of desperation. The cave remained in the mountains, ready to shelter the next lost soul who needed time and space to heal, but Emma had moved beyond needing that shelter. She had become instead the kind of person she had once desperately needed, someone who could offer help without hidden agendas, protection without control, hope without false promises. Helping others heal from their own traumas, Emma had completed her own healing journey. The woman who had once fled civilization had learned to create the kind of civilization worth living in, one based on genuine care, earned trust, and the understanding that the strongest among us are often those who have been broken and learned to rebuild themselves into something more beautiful than they were before. Her wilderness years were over, but their lessons lived on in every life she touched, every protocol she developed, every young physician she mentored who would carry her insights forward into their own careers of healing. Emma Blackwood had become exactly what the world needed, a healer who understood that the deepest wounds could become sources of the greatest strength, and that those who had survived the worst of human nature were often best equipped to bring out the best in others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.